In the grey light of a Warsaw morning, Manya Sklodowska pressed her back to the cold wall of the schoolroom. Russian voices echoed down the corridor. She kept her eyes on the floorboards. One wrong word could bring the inspector to her family door. Her father's wages had already been cut. The books they once read together now hid behind the piano. Poland was not theirs to speak of aloud. Yet inside her chest the question still burned. Why did the stars move? What held the atoms together? Then the fever took her mother. The house grew silent except for the sound of her sister's coughing. Bronya lay pale for weeks. Manya sat by the bed and whispered promises she had no power to keep. When the second coffin left the church, the winter wind cut through her coat like a blade. She returned to her lessons with tighter fists. At night, she studied by the stove until the coal ran out. The Russian headmaster watched her from the doorway. She answered every question in perfect Russian and gave nothing else. They would not take her mind as well. Years folded into one another. She worked as a governess in the countryside. Letters from Paris arrived thin and full of longing. Bronya had reached the city and married. The invitation came at last. Manya packed one trunk and left before dawn. The train crossed the border at night. She watched the fields give way to foreign lights. In Paris, the streets smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. She found a sixth-floor room with a single cracked window. The bed was narrow. The stove smoked when it lit at all. Bread and tea became her meals. She walked the long blocks to the Sorbonne because the omnibus cost too much. Rain soaked her only coat. Her fingers grew stiff from copying notes in unheated lecture halls. Yet each equation she copied felt like a step away from the shadows she had left behind. Other students passed her in the corridors. They spoke quickly in French she barely followed. She kept her head down and wrote until the pencil dulled. At night, the hunger returned like an old companion. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and read until the candle guttered. One evening, the wind blew the window open. Papers scattered across the floor. She gathered them slowly. Her hands shook from cold and from something deeper. She had crossed an empire to stand here. The equations waited on the table. She sat again. The city outside kept its indifferent roar. She would master the physics. She would not return empty. The room stayed cold. The hunger stayed sharp. But the resolve settled into her bones like iron. She stepped from the cold room into the grey light of Paris. Her resolve held firm. The streets pulled her toward the laboratories where invisible forces waited to be named. She carried her equations like armor. Hunger still gnawed, but it sharpened her focus now. The meeting came without warning. A quiet man stood at the blackboard in the physics hall. Pierre Curie turned at the sound of her steps. His eyes held the same hunger she felt for the unseen. He spoke of magnetic fields and the strange rays that escaped from uranium salts. His voice stayed low, yet it filled the space between them. Marie listened without interrupting. She answered with her own observations on the penetrating power of those rays. The air grew heavier with each exchanged idea. They spoke of crystals that bent light and metals that revealed new behaviors under pressure. No social formalities slowed the exchange. Convention had no place in that room. They stayed late into the evening. The gas lamps flickered as shadows lengthened across the benches. Pierre showed her his electrometer. Its delicate needle trembled at the presence of invisible charge. Marie placed her hand near the device and watched the deflection grow. Their shared silence said more than any declaration. The partnership formed in that moment without ceremony. They agreed to work side by side on the rays that refused to be explained. Marie brought her determination from Warsaw. Pierre offered his instruments and his steady presence. The laboratory became their world. Days blurred into nights while they measured and recorded. Danger entered quietly at first. The uranium compounds released heat that burned their fingers during handling. Fumes from the acids they used to separate the elements stung their eyes and lungs. Yet neither turned away. The obsession deepened with each failed test. They sought the source of the energy that seemed to come from nothing. Marie wrote notes by lamplight while Pierre adjusted the apparatus. Their hands brushed over the same page. The bond strengthened through the work itself. Friends whispered about the impropriety of their long hours together. The couple paid no heed. Science demanded their full attention, and they gave it without reserve. One night, the electrometer registered a stronger signal than before. They had isolated a fraction of the unknown element. The room smelled of scorched metal and sweat. Pierre met her gaze across the table. In that look passed the promise of years ahead. The rays still hid their full nature. The experiments would grow more hazardous. Still, they continued. The city outside remained indifferent. Inside the laboratory, the partnership held against every convention and every risk. Their resolve settled like iron. The work had only begun. Yet the first signs of strain already crept into their days. Marie's fingers grew raw from handling the heavy sacks. Pierre's back ached under the weight of the ceaseless stirring. They ignored the warnings that whispered from their own bodies. The rays demanded more. The shed grew colder as winter pressed in. Steam rose from the boiling vats and mingled with the faint blue glow that clung to every surface. At night, the vessels seemed alive. They cast a light that no lamp could match. Marie stood before them and felt the strange warmth on her skin. It was not heat from fire. It was something deeper, something that refused to be named. Skepticism met them at every turn. Colleagues visited and left with polite smiles that hid their doubt. The measurements were too clean, the claims too vast. No one had seen such persistence in elements before. Pierre presented the data again and again. Each time the room grew quieter. The silence carried more weight than any spoken refusal. Their health slipped in small, unnoticed ways at first. A persistent cough settled in Marie's chest. Pierre's hands trembled when he lifted the glassware. They told themselves it was the long hours and the poor air. The truth lay heavier than either would admit. The same glow that lit their nights now marked their skin with faint burns that refused to heal. Word of the luminous discovery began to travel beyond the laboratory walls. Letters arrived from distant cities. Reporters sought entry to the shed. Marie turned them away each time. The work could not pause for curiosity. Yet the world pressed closer. The name Radium appeared in newspapers that neither of them read. Fame arrived without invitation. Still they returned each morning. The partnership held through every ache and every unanswered question. Outside the city moved on in different streets. Inside the shed the air thickened with unseen force. Their resolve remained iron. The next fraction of pure radium waited in the residue of another ton of pitch blende. They would extract it or break trying. They returned each morning. The partnership held through every ache and every unanswered question. Outside the city moved on in different streets. Inside the shed the air thickened with unseen force. Their resolve remained iron. The next fraction of pure radium waited in the residue of another ton of pitch blende. They would extract it or break trying. Recognition came without warning. Telegrams arrived first, then letters sealed with foreign crests. The Nobel Prize in Physics reached them in 1903. Marie and Pierre shared it with Henri Becquerel. The world called it glory. She felt only the weight of unfinished work. The second prize followed years later. This time the chemistry Nobel stood in her name alone. 1911 brought the cables and the crowds. Yet the honors arrived like distant thunder. They could not muffle the silence at home. Pierre died on a Paris street in 1906. A horse-drawn wagon crushed him. The blow came without mercy or farewell. Marie stood at the graveside while rain soaked her black dress. Their daughters waited in another room. Irene asked questions that had no answer. Eve cried until her voice gave out. Grief settled into her bones. She returned to the laboratory the next morning. The benches still held his notebooks. The instruments remembered his hands. Students lowered their eyes when she entered. Some whispered that a woman could not lead such work. Scandal followed the second prize. Newspapers printed her name beside another man's. The affair with Paul Langevin became public spectacle. Crowds gathered outside her door. Stones struck the windows at night. She shielded the girls with her body and refused to speak. Prejudice sharpened every day. The French Academy denied her a seat. Colleagues claimed her discoveries belonged to Pierre alone. Letters of support arrived from distant laboratories. They could not replace the empty chair at the table. She raised the daughters in the narrow apartment. Lessons continued between experiments. Irène learned numbers at the kitchen table. Ève practiced scales while Marie wrote reports by lamplight. Sleep came in short fragments. Each morning she rose before dawn. The radium glowed in its glass tubes. It offered no comfort, yet it demanded her continued attention. The world watched her now with colder eyes. She measured each gram with steady hands. Grief did not grant permission to stop. The second Nobel medal rested in a drawer. She never displayed it. The first prize had already been divided by history. Only the work remained unchanged. She walked the same streets Pierre once walked. The girls followed a step behind. The city offered no mercy. She asked for none. Grief did not grant permission to stop. The war arrived like a second shadow across those same streets. Marie felt its weight before the first reports reached Paris. She would not wait for permission this time either. The decision formed in silence. She gathered what equipment remained from the laboratory. Old tubes, scarce plates. Her own hands shook from the years of exposure, yet she loaded them into the first automobile she could commandeer. The girls watched from the doorway. They did not ask her to stay. They had learned the cost of such requests. Front lines demanded speed. She learned to drive through ruined roads. Shell craters opened beneath the wheels. Mud swallowed the tires and spat them out again. Each mile carried the risk of breakdown. Each breakdown risked the lives waiting at the end. Soldiers lay in barns and tents. Their wounds festered without light. She set up the X-ray apparatus in the open air when no shelter remained. Rain streaked the plates. She shielded them with her own coat. Suffering met her at every stop. Suffering met her at every stop. A boy no older than her own daughters stared at the ceiling while fragments of metal showed white on the screen. She marked the locations for surgeons who worked without rest. Their eyes asked nothing of her past. They needed only the image. She gave it without explanation. Her own breath grew shorter with each journey. Pain threaded through her arms and settled in her bones. She told no one. The mobile units multiplied. She trained other women in the same hurried method. The work expanded faster than supplies allowed. Still, she returned to the lines whenever a new driver faltered. Night runs carried the greatest danger. Headlamps drew fire. She drove with only the faint glow of instruments. The battlefield offered no distinction between scientist and soldier. She asked for none. Her health thinned with every exposure. Radiation she had measured for years now measured her in return. Nights brought fever. Days brought the steady grind of loading and unloading heavy cases. She rested only when the engine failed or the road ended in barbed wire. In those pauses she saw Pierre's face in the faces of the wounded. The resemblance was never exact, yet it returned without mercy. One afternoon the unit reached a field hospital under bombardment. The tent flaps whipped in the wind. She positioned the apparatus while shells fell closer. A surgeon shouted for the next image. She adjusted the tube with steady fingers, though her vision blurred at the edges. The soldier on the table did not move. His eyes found hers for a single moment. She held the gaze until the plate was exposed. Then the moment passed into the next order. The war stretched on. She lost count of the units deployed. Each success brought only the next demand. Her laboratory in Paris waited untouched. The work at the front had become the only laboratory that mattered. When the final armistice came, she drove the last vehicle back through emptied roads. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shelling. She parked the automobile outside the familiar building. Her hands remained on the wheel long after the engine cooled. Only the work remained unchanged. Only the work remained unchanged. She crossed the threshold with measured steps. Each breath drew heavier than the last. The radium traces lingered in her bones like uninvited guests. The laboratory waited in dim light. Instruments stood ready, yet her hands trembled before they touched the glass. Aplastic anemia had crept forward without mercy. It stripped her strength one cell at a time. She knew the cause. Her own discoveries had turned inward. She lowered herself onto the stool. The familiar ache spread through her limbs. Sacrifice had always demanded payment. Pierre had paid first. The war had taken its own toll. Now the invisible rays exacted their final cost. The light she had released refused to leave her body. It burned slow and constant. She closed her eyes against the fatigue. Memories surfaced in fragments. The pitch-blend awe, the endless separations, the moment the electrometer needle jumped. Those nights had felt eternal. The institute continued without pause. Younger researchers moved through the corridors. They carried her methods forward. Treatments for tumors grew from the same elements that now hollowed her marrow. Radium needles saved lives elsewhere while they condemned her own. She watched them work. Pride mixed with the pain. She reached for the notebook. The entries grew shorter each week. Her script wavered on the page. Still, the equations held meaning. They pointed toward new applications. Energy drawn from atoms. Medicine shaped by decay. The modern world absorbed these gifts without question. Outside the windows, the city rebuilt itself. Streets filled again. Children played where trenches had once cut the earth. Her work threaded through every hospital and laboratory now rising. It offered illumination where darkness had ruled. She felt the weight of that gift settle against her failing heart. The final months narrowed to this room. Colleagues visited in careful rotation. They spoke of progress. She listened. Her replies came in fragments. The anemia advanced relentlessly. Blood transfusions bought days. They could not reverse the damage she had invited. She accepted the bargain in silence. The element she had named would outlast her. Its half-life stretched across centuries. Her own span had already shortened. Her hulk. One evening she remained after the others left. The equipment hummed softly. She traced the curve of a flask with one finger. The glow within had guided generations. It would continue long after her pulse faded. The laboratory held its vigil. She drew one last steady breath. The work endured.